Good morning. I am Dr. Ben Hayes, pastor of First Baptist Church, Dadeville, Alabama, and I'm bringing you the thought for the day. I hope that today has started out good for you. It has been a great morning as we've sat out on the front porch listening to the rain fall and experiencing the joys of God's creation. But over the last several weeks, we've been doing this, talking about different things, talking about the promises of God, the power of God, the attributes of God, and how all of those things are connected. And truthfully, who we are is based very much in all three of those things: the promises, the power, and the attributes of God. Who we are is about who God is, especially for those of us who are believers. But for those who are unbelievers, it's true as well. Because if you're an unbeliever, that says a lot about who you are, the choices that you've made. But the problem is that as believers, sometimes we don't realize who we are. For example, have you been different over the last 9 to 10 weeks since this pandemic began? Has your lifestyle been different? Well, of course it has. You have been stuck at home. You have been limited in what you could do. You've had to make decisions about whether you're going to wear a mask or not wear a mask. All of these things have come to play in this vegetable soup, this mixture of who we are and what is going on in the world around us. But that's true in everyday life. Our circumstances, in many cases, determine who we are. When I am with my grandchildren, I am different than when I am in the sanctuary leading a worship service. For example, this past weekend we were in a park in Montevallo, Alabama with our grandchildren. And believe it or not, I was on stage at the park with two of my granddaughters, and we were doing dance steps. Now, you may not believe that, and I don't believe there's any video of this, so you'll never get to see it, which is a very good thing. But who we are depends on our circumstances. In the worship service, I try to be the pastor that God has called me to be and to use all of the gifts that God has given me. But I'm different depending on where I am and who I am with. Well, the truth of the matter is, we're all that way. But there are certain things that should never change, no matter what our circumstances are. Certain attributes of our lives that should always be the same. And that's what we're talking about this week, is who we are. And I'm going to talk about several of those as we continue through this week. And I'm going to start here in Matthew chapter 5. You'll recognize this as the Sermon on the Mount. And right after the Beatitudes, Jesus comes out with one of those statements telling us who we are, not who we should be, not what we might want to be like, but he says if we are believers, if we are his followers, if we are his disciples, then this is who we are. And in verse 13 he says this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? Is it then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men?" Now, in our day, we don't really get that too much, because salt is something we go to the grocery store, we pick it up in a little canister, and we bring it home and we put it in our salt shakers and we use it until it's gone, and then we just continue on. But back in Jesus' day, salt was a little bit different. It was filled with impurities. And if the impurities were too great in the salt, it would lose its ability to be salt. Well, there were several things that salt did. Salt would flavor the food that you eat. Now, how many of us, as soon as we sit down at the table, we have our plate in front of us, before we taste anything, we grab the salt shaker and we just shake it on real good, because we know that everything tastes better with a little bit of salt, right? Well, salt was used for that back in those days, as it is in our day. But salt was also used to preserve meat. Now, for those of you who are in the older generation, you know what I'm talking about. There was no refrigeration, and so our grandparents and great-grandparents would use salt to preserve the meat that they would keep. And that was a big part of the way it was used back in Jesus' day. So it was a flavoring and it was a preservative. But so often, because of the impurities, it would lose its ability to do either of those things. And so then they would just take whatever salt they had and they would throw it on the footpath to kill the grass so that they could walk without having to have the weeds all up around their ankles. So, what exactly does Jesus mean when he says that we are the salt of the earth? Well, I think as believers, it means those very same things, that we are truly the flavoring of our society. What we do should influence what our society becomes. And that's so hard for us to understand because our influence as believers has dwindled in recent generations. I can remember as a boy growing up and how much the church was a part of the community. In fact, it was such a part of the community that businesses didn't open on Sunday. On Wednesday, they closed down at noon so that everybody could get ready and go to a prayer meeting on Wednesday night. Everything revolved around the church. Activities revolved around the church. There were no youth sports on Sundays or Wednesdays because of that. Everything was focused on the church because the church was the influencer of society. And now society influences us. Society tells us what we can do. And we have to schedule everything around youth sports and football games and athletic events and whatever else is going on around us if we want to reach people today. But we are to be a flavoring in our world. That means that you need to affect the people around you. That means that your lifestyle must be such that people will see a need to become like you. But we're also a preservative in this world. In fact, as you get over into the passages dealing with the last days, what you discover is that after the church is removed from the face of planet Earth, great evil breaks out and terrible things begin to happen as the world moves to its final moments. Why? Because the church has been removed and that preservative influence is no longer there. You say, well, I don't really get that. Well, think about it. You remember back in the Old Testament even, when the angel of the Lord came to Abraham and told him that he was about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham bargained with God and said, well, what if you find 50 righteous men there? And God says, I'll not destroy it. And he got him all the way down to 10. And God said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. Why? Because if there were 10 men in that community, they would have the ability, 10 righteous men in that community, they would have the ability to influence that community and change the whole culture that was there. That's the way we ought to be in our community. We ought to live our lives in such a way that we are flavoring and preserving. Because God says, if we're not doing those things, the only thing we're good for is to throw out and be trampled underfoot. What a sad thought. We've got a great deal of work to do, church. Let me encourage you. Be salt where you are today.